to hear that? Cool. Then without further ado, I'd like to open this debate and give the floor to the Prime Minister.
No, it's loud enough, don't worry.
I'll be loud.
It's very loud, don't worry, it's very loud.
Thanks, Alright. The reason people like Jordan Peterson end up having large followers immediately when they start speaking out in public is not because they've convinced millions of followers in a day or two or overnight. It's because these views already exist in large numbers in society. The only problem on op is that they go underground and become significantly worse and harder. Two things in this speech panel. One, why people believe this stuff anyways, and two, why these views, when not represented in mainstream media, become significantly hardened and it leads to worse consequences, both socially and politically. Before that, I just wanted to make one point in terms of like what we support. I think it's quite obvious, but in general, we support these individuals being brought on talk show hosts, on public debates with other individuals, and so on and so forth. Hopefully that's fairly clear, but we broadly support the trend that is going on in the status quo. Right, first argument. Why people believe this stuff anyways? I've got three broad reasons here. The first is that there is an insecurity in a large amount of people in today's society about their positions of power in society being threatened, being eroded where they don't have as much political and cultural capital as they once used to have. What does this mean, right? This means, for example, feminism, right? Obviously everyone here supports it, but it's unarguable that it is a zero-sum game, right? Because the more women you promote, the more women that get hired, the fewer men that get hired, right? So ultimately, for liberal movements tend to threaten the positions of men in society. If you're going to prioritize ethnic minorities, you end up following policies such as affirmative action, which also tend to threaten white individuals, men and women, right? While these policies are good, they do threaten directly large amounts of people who tend to become insecure, right? So the fact that they believe in sort of sexist beliefs, right? Or the fact that minorities aren't actually as good as them tend to be reactionary based on their insecurities. But two, because of fast-paced social change. The problem isn't just social change, it's the extent and the speed in which it has happened, right? Because from 2000, where you had no recognition of gay rights, 2015, where the US legalized gay marriage, all in the span of 15 years, shows that things are changing too quickly. So the America or the Europe or the country you grew up in is no longer where you are now. So there's a sense of discomfort and not belonging in your own society, which leads people to believing these things. The third and last point here is often the views that Jordan Peterson defend belong often to white men, white individuals in society. Right? The problem is a lot of arguments about promoting minorities, promoting women, tend to vilify young men by saying all white men have privilege, right? Regardless of whether this is true or not, the point is that white men often don't perceive themselves to be privileged, right? They're often awkward, they're not always rich. To be perfectly honest, most white men are just mediocre, right? And they perceive themselves to not be at the epitome of society. But when they are accused of being in that position, of holding this large degree of social capital and using it to actively suppress people, when they themselves perceive that they have done nothing wrong or comparable to that. That is right, the point. The reason why Trump was so popular, despite saying every politically incorrect view possible, and actively offended lots of people, was not because he convinced everyone in 2 weeks that that is what correct is, but because he tapped into a feeling of resentment that already existed in society. So OP has to contend that these feelings never go away. What therefore happens when you don't give these individuals mainstream presence? Two things here. First, about why these views become hardened and worse. A couple of things on this point. First, they end up believing that the world is run by conspiracies. Their worldview is seen as the factually correct worldview, that our position is being challenged by the undeserving, by those who aren't as good as us. They are where we should be. We have a right to that position. But why then is no one in media, no one in politics, saying what we believe to be how the world is shaped? They tend to think that they are therefore the underprivileged who are actively being locked out of society and politics. The second is the bubble effect, right? These views exist, but they only tend to increasingly interact with people who share similar opinions and similar beliefs. When you get entrapped into that bubble, you end up worsening that, you end up hardening those beliefs because you cut yourself off from what the other side believes. This changes, I'll go into this a bit more, but this changes when you have mainstream leaders talking to other people in public, when your debates are being active, your views are actively being challenged. But when they're not, all you end up doing is more firmly believing in these things. And the third thing here is why why these are worsened, as I pointed out earlier, is because they feel personally attacked when sort of views are thrown in the air, but there is no one to defend them. When there is no one to defend them, they feel like they have to defend their views and their position in power themselves. What does that affect? It leads to a feeling of rage, of anger, of unfairness in the world. What does this lead to? I'll go on to that after I take closing.
So all the views just described are already promoted by the White House today. What exactly is your deadline?
No, but the White House is a consequence of these views as well, right? The point is Jordan Peterson precedes, but also will still exist after Trump inevitably goes out of the White House as well, right? In all likelihood, Trump is an anomaly, right? It's unlikely that you're going to get a president of the US who supports that kind of view. Anyways, also, in all fairness, we support the views. I mean, we kind of have to support. If you're saying these views are Trump's views, we have to support them being in the mainstream media as well. So therefore, his being in power is sort of like on our side. I mean, yeah, that's the thing there. Right, consequences. First, why these views are moderated when you have people like Jordan Peterson in public. One, like, Jordan Peterson is bad, sure. He's a sexist, he's almost certainly a Islamophobe, so on, but his views aren't as worse as your average outright individual's views. Why? He still says there should be no violence against women. He still admits the horrors of slavery. Well, yes, he thinks you shouldn't shape your society against LGBTQ movements and rights, but he still says that is a valid identity and they should be respected for who they are. Often the people who tend to follow these individuals have far worse beliefs. As I told you, that over the past few decades, these views have been hardened to become much worse than the ones represented by these mainstream leaders. So these individuals seem to latch on to people like Jordan Peterson, but they see a more moderated version of what they're saying, which pulls them to the left, to the center a bit more. But also when Jordan Peterson is attacked or challenged or forced to defend himself and is not always able to defend himself accurately, you may think, perhaps I'm not entirely correct. That may not affect a large amount of people, the number of people it affects is still crucial and important. That effect moderates the followers themselves. Second thing, it leads to people adopting extra democratic means because they are locked with the political system because no one supports them. The Charlottesville riots are a perfect example. You resort to protest, to riots, to violence, to planning attacks, disrupting other protests and rallies because you think there is no way for you to access the political system directly, so you must adopt extra democratic means in order to get there. But the third thing is that it erodes trust in the political system. It increases distrust because these people are ones who don't tend to vote because there's no one for them to vote for, right? Even the Republicans, before Trump, never represented a worldview which supported the way they thought about the world. So sure, they may say 5% of people not voting isn't a big deal, but 5% of people rioting, planning attacks, and believing that violence is a legitimate way in which to express their political discontent is a huge thing that leads to large-scale violence, that leads to people being attacked, that leads to minorities being attacked, and things like the incel forum. For all those reasons, ultimately, these people do deserve a voice proposed.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Assad gave us a lot of analysis on the areas of analysis where it is easy to analyze. Fortunately for us, those are also the areas we agree with. White America is mostly predisposed to agree with these messages because of a feeling that they were screwed by privilege that they never had to begin with. Okay, we agree. The only part Assad is woefully lacking in is explaining why challenging these messages in the mainstream will be in any way effective when the people hearing them are predisposed in all the myriad ways that Assad already analyzed. We say simply, those are exactly the reasons why challenging those messages in that context is just completely ineffective. Our alternative is exactly like what Aziz Ansari prompted SNL, right? Thank you for staying quiet. Thank you for accepting the normative boundaries. Thank you for being abhorrent racists, but shutting up about it. We say, when we move the normative boundaries to the places where those people feel more comfortable, what happens is not that they are moderated, but rather that they are emboldened, radicalized, and exposed more, and act more on their beliefs. We'll talk firstly on how these messages are actually understood and not just actually how they're delivered, why it leads to more of these bad beliefs in society, and secondly, on how that expresses itself as more to affect the society. Before that, a few points of rebuttal. So, The first part we mostly agree with about predispositions. So, firstly, the idea that then otherwise people will believe in conspiracy theories. Two answers. One, not many people believe in conspiracy theories. They're massively overselling like this mostly fringe outcome. Secondly, those theories that Jordan Peterson is advancing and Sam Harris are conspirative by themselves. It is a claim that science has shown like these things, and the scientific community is all hiding it from you. It is using the language of science and the language of quasi-objectivity to say that there is a false consensus by scientists and left-wing media in order to advance incorrect views. So you can't make people not conspirative by exposing them to views which are conspirative themselves. This idea of the bubble just assumes that mainstream challenging would be effective in any way otherwise the comparative is just significantly worse because you get the same echo effect in the mainstream, and this idea that Peterson is not that bad we will engage with. Again, this idea that it will express itself as violence in the mainstream is entirely contingent on the rest. Racists are more emboldened than actually on the comparative. Our side is what leads to more violence and more like lack of buy-in into the government. So this entire point is just contingent on the rest of the debate, but an extra win point for whoever wins the clap that actually calls. So, first of all, why a lot of these people will believe these messages. So the first third of my page I can skip because Assad already did it. People are incredibly predisposed to believe opinions which validate their own identities, especially in a world of identity politics, which blames two types of people. First of all, the privileged ones who don't want to give up their privilege, like inherently. It's not like what they rationalize, but it's what they actually feel. And secondly, the people who feel like they never had any privilege to begin with and are just like, at least feel victimized by identity politics, which say, now we're taking other people into university over your white self, even though nobody in their family has ever attended the college of any kind. So, those two different, by the way, OG populations. So, about these people. First thing we say, they are not really persuaded by rational analysis. And we say that's not like because they're stupid, it's because for the most part, nobody is. Why is that? First of all, each of us should know from their personal experiences that for that to be untrue. Secondly, we say being persuaded by rational analysis requires two things that most people do not possess or are not like willing to invest the energy to possess in the context of any discussion. Firstly, to invest quite a lot of time in investigating the claims, and secondly, to do so from an impartial perspective, something which people not only are unable to do, but have no interest in doing for the very most part of the time. Like they want to argue defensively for their side. They don't want an impartial observation. So as any debater should know, they can always rationalize and find justifications for why their side is right. They are extremely aided by the fact that the deliverers of that message are extremely adept at providing exactly these kinds of justifications.
Okay.
These justifications, which are quasi-scientific, which are easy to believe and easy to buy. We say, therefore, rational analysis does not work. But moving the norms does. Why? First, on the first level of analysis, it changes behavior. It makes you conceal behavior that you perceive to be unacceptable in the mainstream, and that's a good in and of itself. But on the second level, we say people tend to act, but also think conformatively and orthodoxically. People don't want to think of themselves as different. Like, yes, these fringe groups on the internet that are like are the Donald do, but the main majority of the people that are going to be affected by these messages, like the main majority of white people that will be affected by these messages in the mainstream, actually don't. They want to be conformists. They want to be hardworking, tax-paying people with a family. You know these messages because you've heard them in politics. That's what people want to identify with, and like everybody else. And so they're extremely affected by them. On the third level, we say behavior oftentimes shapes thinking, like I internalize the ways in which I behave in order to shape my thinking patterns. And on the fourth level, we say just the next generation is going to only be affected by what I externalized, and we'll have a significantly more racist next generation because they're being exposed by their parents, by figures of authority, by television, which is perceived to be authoritative, into all of these bad messages. So norms move drastically in a way which shapes both behavior and thinking to a drastically more radical direction. Closing with longer extension.
So, like, a lot of people already buy into such beliefs. Are these just changing their opinions essentially?
So they mostly are going to try to win this debate by using like the words "a lot of people" in the stupidest way. We are talking in opening opposition about 60% or 70% of the population, the majority of people in the world which are only exposed to mainstream media and would, because of all of Assad's analysis, find these claims to be extremely attractive. Andre's a lot of people, is like 100,000 people on the internet. We just don't care as long as we can keep it off the public sphere for as long as we can and for as much as we can. We don't think you'll be able to comparatively analyze why they could be persuaded in any significant way due to all the analysis. Second point there, when, and Monica will go more into this, is that when my intuition supports that I believe something, I just use my rational mechanism in order to justify it. And please note that it's not about the message that Peterson delivers, it's about the message that's understood. So we have to consider like the fact that people have a limited time and limited intellectual capacity to invest in understanding these messages. They'll just take a simplistic version of sexes are different, there's just two genders. It's of course what they say, right? There's just two genders, etc. We say, secondly, when racists are involved in this context, they behave more racistly, we get more racist public opinion, we get more racist market. This creates an environment which is more hostile towards minorities in general. And when the next Supreme Court ruling has this to rule about selling wedding cakes to a gay couple, you can bet what they're going to rule on.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Three areas of rebuttal in this speech, followed by a point of extension on Assad's analysis. Starting off, I just want to deal firstly with the POI that we get from closing opposition, adding some more responses to what Assad's already said, because they said we already have Trump. I mean, firstly, this is going to be in tension with all of their arguments if they support that and think that that's a sufficient outlet for these people's views, because it basically implies that putting this out in the mainstream would be a good thing anyway, and that it's just about the degree in this debate, which would concede a lot of the things that OO have said, so that will be a huge issue for their side if they do decide to run that. But the second thing is, ultimately, Trump is because these views were not heard before the 2016 election. It is not a surprise that Peterson has come to popularity post-2016, because it was at that point that these people realized that these views weren't being represented. Op would have to support a world in which Trump was president, but people didn't get to hear their concerns heard about, which had led them to elect Trump as president in the first place. And that would be a very bizarre thing to do, given particularly that I think Peterson often has like better thought out versions of Trumpian views and is much more willing to engage in rational debate than Trump is. So it was very unclear why Op wanted to support Trump over Peterson. So I think that deals with that. And now I want to get on to the opening opposition case, because they asserted that we had not provided reasons for things despite Assad providing 3 reasons for them, but then asserted a thing that they did not in fact provide reasons for. Their premise was that norms are led top down. That if someone says something, society shifts in the direction of what that person says, and as a result, the boundaries of what is acceptable shift. There are 3 reasons that isn't true. The first is an empirical one. If you look at the election of Trump, it was clearly not the case that these things being said 10 years before led to this, because as soon as Trump came out, there was a huge groundswell of support. Either you have to believe, if their analysis is true, within 3 months, Trump convinced 52% of the population that he was correct on a range of issues which had not been discussed in US politics before, or you have to believe these people believed these things before that, Trump came and was a representative of those views, i.e. that change comes from the bottom up to the top, a different conception than the one opening opposition had. The second thing to say here is people are only popular if there is a market for those views already in existence. So that is again an argument for why bottom-down is a more effective model for looking at this debate. And the third thing to say is that Peterson was one of these people in the first place. Peterson had to come from a group of people who already existed, because he didn't just come up with his beliefs in isolation. There was a social system and set of conditions which Assad explained to you in the first point. That is why it was hugely tactically naive of them to concede the entirety of Assad's first argument, because it was precisely those conditions which led to the rise of Peterson, but also led to the rise of a huge base of support who were convinced of this before Peterson started talking. So let's get on to saying that. Let's get on to the issue of whether people, the number of people rather who believe this, because basically the entire contention from open opposition is that challenging them wouldn't work. So this thing on normative boundaries, I think the normative boundaries have already been changed, even if it's regardless of how they've been changed. Trump has been elected in this world, and therefore these views have to be heard. They seem to think that if you pretended Trump out of existence, that it would be fine, because the next generation of people will just forget that he existed. It was very unclear in their world exactly how these views got less social salience. They just sort of asserted that they did. Because I think the second thing to say here is that politics and media are actually quite a small part of most people's lives. It's not that people take their view from politics and media. They don't spend very long reading it. They take their views from their interactions around them. It's far more powerful when that person doesn't get the job and a woman gets it, even if that woman probably got it on merit. That's not what they believe, and that's where these views are stemming from and not the people talking to them. Then they said, no, actually, you can't convince these people by rational argument. I think two things here. One is to note, Assad's argument in his case did not rely on rational argument persuading these people. All it relied upon was when you see yourself represented in the mainstream media, you're less likely to think there is a conspiracy against you. That's not a rational argument. That's not a careful unpicking. I agree, it's unlikely that carefully unpicking Peterson's arguments is probably not going to have a huge amount of effect. But the thing is here is that ultimately there's clearly a spectrum of what people believe, and Peterson is on the more rational end of that spectrum, and that is why he is the one representing them. It was a bizarre world that they talked about, and this is the second response here, because they seem to think that Jordan Peterson didn't exist in their world. He did exist in their world, but he was popular on 4chan and Reddit and was never put in the mainstream media. People still heard him, so even if their model of top-down information is correct, people were still getting that information from him, but they weren't seeing him in the mainstream media. Maybe fewer people saw that, and that might be a small benefit they can claim on their side. But what was much worse, is, as I had told you, is even if it was a smaller number of people who had these beliefs, they held them much more violently. They felt the political process wasn't able to help them, and they were going to go burn down buildings as a result, rather than switch on BBC News and see their views represented. Yes.
According to your logic, Trump coming into the mainstream should have broken the bubble effect, made people feel that the world is not in a conspiracy against them, and overall made the world less racist and more pleasant. Do you think that's happened?
That is a gross straw man of our case. I mean, we never said any of those things would happen if Trump was elected. I would suggest to you, though, it is much better that Trump has been elected and people are taking the issues head on now and are discussing them out in public, rather than a situation in which somehow you bar Trump from being elected, even though these views already existed. These people get much more angry and have to resort to extra parliamentary means in order to resolve their disputes. Secondly, on what their beliefs will be, because all they really said here is that, it's not like that Peterson is contingent on these things. But I think we've responded to this when we said he still exists. It's not these beliefs go away, and even if fewer people hold them, it becomes more radical. On to my final point, the legitimacy of these beliefs. I don't agree with much of the alt-right. But what I will say is that politics is not just about what is right, what people are willing to accept. And to that extent, having the alt-right in the sphere of political discourse is actually an important thing. And the reason it's an important thing is because it reminds politicians that a significant number of people do believe these views in the first place, and that if they are trying to build a national consensus, they have to account for these views, even if they personally don't like them. To use an example here, with immigration, Brexit as a political class, people ignored the issue of immigration for 20 years. That's their model, ignoring it and hoping it goes away. It didn't go away. It resulted in a new political party rising, them demanding a referendum and a far more catastrophic political outcome resulting from that. That is what happens when you ignore these groups. They find other ways to get to the surface. They don't just disappear. The second thing to say here is that politicians need to know when they need to moderate change. It might be when you institute an affirmative action policy, you need to institute it in a different way or a lower threshold to get more people on in the first place. I agree, you're never going to get the radical alt-right people on board, but the moderate people who view Peterson and think, oh, he may have a point, but who could be persuaded if the threshold was lowered, that's the sort of thing that you need to know about. Politics has to be connected to the people. It can't be totally out of step with what even 10% of the population believe. And that's why, even if we don't agree with this representation, it is a good thing for politics, and why I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
When radio broadcasters in Rwanda in 1994 told people to go out to the street with machetes, they thought that this is what everyone does, and they went and they slaughtered the Tutsi. When Benjamin Netanyahu told that the Arabs are going to vote, therefore all of the Jews should vote as well, the norm was that it's okay to say that Arabs are bad and are a threat. What we come and tell you in opening opposition is that, first of all, in terms of change, we don't have to show that things would be better. We just have to show that they're going to be worse in the normalization of hatred that exists, and everyone agrees in those opinions of the intellectual dark web. But also, we're going to show you why there is a way to change by shifting the norms and not having the mutual exclusivity between what is right in society and what is wrong getting the same platform here. And that is our case. Now, notice that about the point that these views already exist in society, this ignores our basic idea that says that it does exist, but it is not articulated in the minds of people in that way, in that objective way that tells you that objectively, of course, the veil is bad. Scientifically, of course, we know that all liberal values are much better than anything Islam or any other religion has to offer. And first of all, this creates this shift in the minds of people because it gave a voice to what was just a feeling that they didn't even know how to describe. Secondly, they ignore the fact that what we say about norms is more complicated. Norms shift not because I personally change my beliefs, but because I perceive that society's mainstream thinks differently than I do. People tend to act like a herd. People tend to follow what they think is expected from them and what is normative. Meaning that if I think that everyone else around me possesses a hateful opinion, I would think that when it comes down to an action, even if I think differently, I would be pressured and I would have an effect to feel that I need to act just like the rest of my peers. Because if not, I would be the outcast. And that is why we have seen those examples. So we might have someone who doesn't think himself of a racist, but when it comes down to a vote in Switzerland about the height of mosques and minaret, he would vote like he thinks everyone else in his area would vote and how his likely surroundings would vote. And this is where our impacts become much, much stronger. Now, I would further analyze why specifically this happens in the mainstream, but a quick word just about the idea of the progressive. Notice that OG ignore the fact, they just tell us, oh, you want to let things go and for them to continue the way they are. No. What we say is that progressives, especially these days, are aware of the fact now that there was a bubble, especially in the age of Trump. They now know that they cannot ignore others. And that is why we think that it is very likely for them and for their politicians to go and try and change and engage. But that leads me to my constructive why. Because we say that when those opinions are not in the mainstream but on the web, who sees them? First of all, notice that this is a pool medium, meaning that only a few people, maybe 100,000, actually want to see that out of their own volition because they are A, tech savvy and young. These are not people that are over the age of 40. And B, know who to look for and what those opinions are. Probably they read a book of them or they look for things on the internet that are similar. That's the first group. And we don't think that this group is likely to get larger because of the feature of the internet and this dark web. But the second group that would be there are the progressives that try to look up for the arguments to argue against, and in order to know what their opposition is. We think that it is very likely that that way they would have the knowledge and the awareness that OG craves so much, but would be able to take those ideas later on to society and then show the answers to them and know what might be expected out of them. Meaning that in the mainstream, when they get more airtime because they don't have to compete with Harris because they get all of the media attention, then they would put their claim forward and their pre-answers and pre-rebuttal to those ideas, making this the norm that would be seen. But what happens if this goes mainstream? Mainstream means TV. Mainstream means news. Mainstream means outlets that people are already less critical of because they tend to think that what appears there is a reflection of what happens in society, and they know that there are certain norms that you cannot cross, meaning that if it appears there, you actually have more normalization. Now, they might think that, oh, it's not a conspiracy, but you know what? That's actually really bad, because if it's not a conspiracy, it means that it's a legitimate opinion, and that is exactly what they don't want. You know what? Yes.
If only small minorities are out of step with the political mainstream, why was it that 52% of people in Brexit and Trump were persuaded by anti-immigrant rhetoric that happened?
Because they got more media attention. And we say that would have been better if in Brexit those people wouldn't have gotten media attention in TV and would have stayed on the outskirts. But moreover, what we tell you is that on TV you don't get nuances there. Why? A, because you have short media exposure there. Usually you have an item of less than 5 minutes, meaning that you don't have time for all of those nuances of, oh, don't hurt the gays, even though they're really bad. Secondly, we say that you don't have time for questions. Usually you just give the platform to the person. Also because you need to show the other side and give them equal time. So one show would give you a progressive, but one show would give you someone more extreme to face Tim Harris, meaning that you get more exposure also to those on the more right. Moreover, we say that Tim Harris doesn't need to use the nuance anymore. Why did he use it right now? Because he wanted to get into the mainstream and knew that there is a barrier. But if he's already there, he doesn't necessarily feel the need, because now he can say just what he thinks and would not be censored or doesn't have any more thresholds. And we say that at the point where this is the message coming across in people's minds, they would be more likely to do the damaging things because they won't have the nuance. They would just have the bad idea and they would think that everyone does it. So at the moment of voting, at the moment of actually doing something to the minority, they would act, and we're afraid of these mobs. We're very proud of them.
I hate to say this, but I agree with CG when they say top has missed the comparative in this debate. Opening government tells us there are views on the right that are important to express. Opening opposition say no, they are better repressed. All this would have been fine if this was a debate about Fox News, given that the right literally has the biggest news networks in the Western world. We believe that comparative is irrelevant. We believe the relevant comparative that should be made here is about public intellectuals and scientists. What is unique about this being a scientific discourse, and what is unique to that? That is going to be my first point. I'm going to talk about what is unique to science. There are parts in opening opposition that have addressed this. I will address them and deepen them significantly. Then I'm going to talk about two unique groups that have not been touched on this debate. One is employers and how they are influenced by this, and second is bureaucrats and policymakers. Before that, just a second. Yeah, the responses we get, note we're not sneaky about this. We have brought this up to open government in a POI saying your delta does not exist. They tell us, oh, but they tell us Peterson preceded Trump. True, but didn't bring Trump to power. Like there is no connection and causal link that they have proven on why these views don't exist on their side or are not expressed on their side. Moreover, right wing in America did not start with Trump. George W. Bush was just as conservative and had many of the same views, and they were expressed in very mainstream platforms. All that means the delta there just does not exist. Rebuttal to closing government. Closing government says there are problems with liberal discourse. Obviously, they are correct. However, three problems with that. First of all, they seem to confuse very niche elements of liberal views, so let's say the Irish debating circuit, with things with mainstream political left. We say that Obama administration and most of his voters did not hold most of the views they're talking about transsexuals and queer discourse and all these things that may be problematic in specific nuances. The fact that there are certain individuals and elements that portray a radical view within liberalism does not justify what they're saying. Second of all, even if that is correct, those views don't change either. They're just what is created usually is more backlash and more closing yourself up against what you see as a radical message coming from the other side. We just don't see why they solve it. Thirdly, note the fact that liberals may sometimes be wrong about, and for example, there may be oppressive elements within Islam, does not mean that Sam Harris is right when he calls Islam the religion of murder and war. Like the fact that they may be wrong on certain nuances does not mean that these people correct those nuances. That causal link was not provided, and Andre will everything Andre says about this will be new material. So, they say, oh, but there is an incentive for liberals to engage now. note, again, by their own analysis, that exists at the point where Trump was elected, that exists at the point where Fox News exists, that is also irrelevant. Finally, they tell us themselves that the discussion in studios and TV is likely to be unnuanced, while Twitter is a great platform. Twitter is not mainstream media. You're defending the other side of the debate. Let's talk about what is unique to science. Monica says this is seen as objective. Let's bring in a bit more of analysis on what this means. First of all, science has a huge ethos within Western society. This is what progressed us. This is what brought us out of the Dark Ages. This is the ethos of what it means to be a Westerner, what it means to be a modern person. Secondly, it is seen as apolitical. There are opinions and there are facts. These are completely different things, and that's why people perceive them. No, sorry, you have not said any of this. Thirdly, you cannot, the average individual person cannot challenge scientific research. He doesn't have the expertise for it. He doesn't have the ability often to access it in the first place. What does all this tell us? This tells us that unlike Sean Hannity saying something, a Harvard professor like Jordan Peterson says something, the ability to and says, here is research that I'm analyzing to you, showing that women are inferior to men, showing that for example, women are likely to be less good CEOs because of the distribution of characteristics and all the things Jordan Peterson explains so well. This is a message that sticks to people significantly more than just hearing a random racist saying these things, because of the academic ethos, because this is now what Oxford and Harvard are saying about these issues and not their individual views. But why doesn't academia? So first of all, note that we get agreement that the people influenced the most from this, or that are exposed through mainstream media and were not exposed before, are people on the political center, because everyone seems to agree in top half that the extreme right-wing people are listening to these people anyway. So the main impact is that now in the political center you get a tectonic shift where it's seen that these is the views of academia, that what the right wing is saying is the truth, and we're saying that is highly problematic. Why is that? First of all, why won't academia just balance this out like they want to suggest? Because the people you invite in mainstream media have to also be kind of interesting, right? And academics generally are not. Like serious academics will say something like, oh, we have research that shows this, but it might also prove the exact opposite. We're not entirely sure, and to talk in very complex terms, which are the way the science should work, the way academic discourse should work, because it's inconclusive, and most of the sciences, definitely in psychology, definitely in political science, are. However, the way Peterson and Harris present this are super objective, very clear-cut, therefore they're more interesting, therefore they get the stage, and even if the other guy gets the stage, he's significantly seen as less persuasive to them than the average person. This leads exactly to tectonic shift in the discourse, and in the center saying, these are the people I am listening to. Opening go.
Fox News and Peterson represent totally different factions. Fox News is the old social conservative right. Peterson is disaffected, pseudo intellectually young, they don't.
That sounds a great analysis that you should have probably had in your speeches. I honestly don't. There was not enough analysis even in that POI to actually know what this argument is in order to address it. Finally, let's talk about the impact specifically on employers. Look, because we have already talked about the shift towards depriving more people of their rights through electing horrible governments. But in terms of employers, they act not by ideology but by profit motive specifically. When they get objective facts, which they are very listening to and very receptive to, saying, for example, Muslim workers, women are less capable, that is not me being racist. That is me having objective reasons given by science to believe that these people are less, that these people should be promoted less, hired less. This is a direct impact, the most clear one on the lives of millions of people, because nobody has proven actually the huge political difference. We are the closest to that, but even if you don't buy any of that, you still buy that individual people listening to their TV, remembering these facts, are likely to discriminate their workers and buy something that's seen as scientific by all the analysis we've given. Therefore, there is huge impact on people's lives. We are very proud to oppose the motion. Thank you very much.
There is a profound irony in the modern West of a thriving academic industry churning out more and more students with diplomas in various subjects, some of which are totally useless. And secondly, a political discourse which is less and less informed about the reality of facts and a functioning academic dialogue. You have a disjunction between these two. side opposition has shown that this is this motion and the influence of these people on the mainstream media has made this disjunction and therefore the disinformation in mainstream discourse much worse. So that's going to be my main point. Before that, response is firstly to closing government and secondly to opening government. Fundamentally, closing government are wrong because they suggest firstly that the modern left is in some ways moronic and believes things which are illogical, and then posits that they will respond entirely rationally to a set of challenges coming to them, and it will produce the best possible results resulting in compromise. Fundamentally, we would say three things on the claims they make about alt-right intellectuals. I'll tell you later. So they suggest reasonably that they say some things which are value or hint at things with value, but we would have three huge caveats on that. Firstly, they tend to result from the manipulation of genuine academic literature. You find a sentence in the conclusion of an article about the different biology of men and women, and then you extrapolate a societal theory on the basis of it. Secondly, they tend to present themselves as possessing a degree of expertise which they don't have. For example, as AL said, presenting yourself as an expert on Islam despite the fact you're a brain scientist. And thirdly, they present the most provocative possible version of the claim. They are deliberately trying to get the most attention. They will not make a reasonable claim about there being nuance or the need for a different view of something. They will say, the world is going to hell because we are handling people's transition with their gender incorrectly, and then deliberately try and say something outrageous in order to get attention. Specifically, we would structurally say, if you are an alt-right intellectual, no thank you, who structures your way in a nuanced way and makes reasonable critiques, you are not going to get the degree of publicity, and therefore you are not going to be one of the ones in the mainstream media which side proposition, no thank you, are talking about. We recognize the basis of closing government's case is actually about how the way people respond to this. Why do they respond in actually the total opposite way to the way which is described? Firstly, we would say that what they depend upon, given that the driving force of current liberalism is kind of academic research, is academics responding to these critiques. In fact, what they'll do is they'll cut out the nuances of their existing articles. Why? Because if you put a nuanced sentence in the conclusion about being concerned about some of the issues raised by side proposition, you will then get quoted by Jordan Peterson in one of his YouTube videos, and the result will be that everyone in your common room will suddenly think that you are an alt-right intellectual, you'll be concerned you're not going to get promotion, you'll be concerned that you'll be labelled a racist. So those sort of critiques, no thank you, get cut out more, and there's less likely to get that degree of moderation which side proposition suggests is specifically useful in the left, and which they say needs to come in. But secondly, we think it is just an empirical fact that the way people have responded to these critiques is by doubling down on their initial claims. If you look at who is winning in Democratic primaries right now, it is not people who are saying, maybe the alt-right has a point, we need to worry about this. If you look at the vast majority of reviews of Jordan Peterson's book by left-wing people, they are all saying this man is a total idiot and a pseudo-intellectual. None of them at any point will say he has a specific viewpoint. We think that when the left's fundamental premises are challenged in such a provocative way, no thank you, they respond in a way which falls into the provocation. And the whole basis of alt-right intellectuals' business model is dependent on them responding irrationally by doubling down, because then they can have the kind of Twitter war or the kind of provocative conflict which they suggest. So instead of having a sensible moderation based on the existence of extremist view, you get people taking extremist views on both sides, and then you get a kind of a process of mutual extremism based on people responding to other provocative claims, which is what I think has objectively happened in terms of academic and intellectual discourse, but also just in terms of political discourse more broadly. Look, even if you don't believe that analysis, and frankly I think it's much better than closing governments, which is pretty rushed, it's got to be at least as plausible as their claim, and therefore they can't win the debate on the basis of that extension. Moving on to opening government. Go for it.
I said, and I quote, young white men who are awkward, not rich, and mediocre are vilified. You can't equate them with Fox News viewers, because Fox News existed before this group became radicalized. They listened to Jordan Peterson because Fox News wasn't enough.
Okay, so I think that's valuable. That's that is a restatement of your material on conspiracy, which I agree hasn't been responded to properly. In terms of your conspiracy analysis, I would say two things. Firstly, the conspiratorial mindset is like chronic. So once you think there's a conspiracy against you, whether there actually is a conspiracy against you is irrelevant to whether like you continue to think there is a conspiracy. So when you see people, when it suddenly is into mainstream media as opposed to being on 4chan, I think you continue to think there's a conspiracy. You think, oh, but it's not on mainstream media every day. This is the fundamental critique of liberalism. Why is it not every show? And I think the example in chief on this is Brexit in the UK, where both Remainers and Brexiteers are convinced the BBC is in a conspiracy against them, despite the fact that it's probably reasonably impartial. So the fact there is no longer a conspiracy doesn't change that. And secondly, the idea of a conspiracy is being explicitly promoted by these people. So when you give them more airtime and more channels on which to promote the idea there's a conspiracy, that means that more people then believe there is a conspiracy. What does that mean? It means that you have the same degree, and in fact, ironically, probably increased further of conspiratorial belief on side proposition side, and more people believe it, and therefore all the harms they give us themselves about like people burning down mosques, etc., apply to a greater extent because there are more of these kind of conspiratorial fanatics. Why do we specifically win this debate? I think we win this debate because we apply it uniquely to Jordan Peterson and to people like this. Much of the debate has, as Ayal points out, been a debate about whether you should have Trump or other far-right people in the media who aren't going to change. Specifically, what science provides is a unique elevation which legitimizes beliefs because of the unique status of science in the Western world. What we would welcome on opposition is the use of science in order to make politics more rational. The irony is that science or academia becomes abused in order to make politics more irrational by supporting the most irrational positions. As Ayal says crucially, those people who are supporting rational applications of academia are poorly placed in order to leverage those applications, and therefore academia comes to have a very poor effect on the political discourse, whilst, as I showed in my rebuttal, also destroying academic discourse at the same time. Very proud to oppose.
Thanks for that round. We thought it was really good, and we also had a good discussion, and we came to an unanimous decision. First, going to opening government, second to opening opposition, third to closing opposition, fourth to closing government. I'm going to walk you through what we think contributions were and how they related, and if you have any questions, you can ask them after. So let's start in opening government. Or actually, I think it makes sense to discuss both top half teams simultaneously, because what I think happens is a lot of what we can credit in top half eventually boils down to whether we believe that either A, people already existed and hold beliefs that can be appealed to either in mainstream media or outside of mainstream media, and if we believe that those people existed already, there may be changes in the way that they can be engaged into either politics or not, or we believe the claim from opening opposition, which is that there were a few of them, but the overwhelming majority of them, or the most aggressive or the most harmful ones, only appeared once they were appealed to in mainstream media. And eventually, I think there's two, and I think most of the other analysis boils down to which one of these two we believe. So there's eventually, I think, two reasons why we credit opening government for this claim. The first one is there's just a lot of reasons they give that stand independent of them being addressed in politics or media for people to hold beliefs like these. So just like characterization of what their lives are like and why they feel entitled to more than they're getting and why they feel deserving and why politicians don't seem to be addressing them. I'm going to agree that there is, and I think this is more an attack from CO than from OO. There is a degree to which I'm not sure that their address happens in the way that they claim it to happen, right? So even if there's people that feel entitled to political representation, and because of the reasons that they give, whether they actually feel like they're getting the political representation to a satisfying degree under like their side of the house in mainstream media is unclear, but it's also not the strongest challenge from opening opposition. So I think that's the first reason to believe that that group is more likely to already exist than the one from opening opposition. But the other reason is just a problem in the logic, or like I think a step you miss in the logic you set out yourself, which is it seems to be that people, in order to gain the traction that you say they do and be able to create the kind of normalization that they do, already need to have a lot of support. So the exact problem in like the chicken or egg question in top half is way more of an issue for your argument than it is for theirs. Because presumably people are only as persuasive as you say they would be if they are already persuasive to the point that they don't actually convince more people than they've already convinced. So then it becomes more likely that people feel a lot more redress and recognition if they see political representation in the mainstream, meaning the violence falls to their side, a lot of the basically all of the impacts that you're all reaching for, which is minimizing the extent to which these views are held both privately and publicly, fall to opening government. So let's bring in closing government. I think this is the first issue with your extension, which is it relies on us not believing that claim was made, and I think both of us did. We already believe that there was a consensus in top half about the extent to which these views are limited being a good thing, uncontroversially. But I think way more importantly, there are two things in the broader idea that you put out that we eventually don't believe. So I think the broad idea is progressives have missed the point of engagement that they should have been having with people that are either conservative or racist or just correct but on a different side of the scientific spectrum from them. But there's two things, and it would be good for them to engage with it because they would be more in line with like truth and science. I think there's two reasons. Eventually, it doesn't really hold the traction it needs. The first reason is it just seems like you're saying that the mainstream left-wing progressive person is as radical as to be the other side of the extreme from these people. And we don't actually think you prove that to the point you need it to be proven. It just seems like the response from CO in saying, but those are equally extreme, and therefore it's unimportant whether or not they address the issues that are in the right-wing extreme, seems sufficient. So that's the first thing. We don't believe that the average left-wing progressive is blind to factual knowledge and is as extreme as you say they would be. But more importantly, we're also not sure why it would be simultaneously true that they were appealing to so many progressives as you say they are, but also still that it would be important for them to address those issues in general. So it seems like there needs to be a group of people that would be convinced by extremist factual knowledge that needs to be addressed by left-wing progressives that you say already appeal to a majority of left-wing progressives that would somehow change the minds of people that we are unaware of that exist. So then I'm like fine with you recognizing a lot of, or like wanting to say that a lot of the facts that these people base their politics on are true, but it doesn't really help you because it means that if anything, it seems either necessary for left-wing progressives to engage with it or not. But if it is as important as you say, it also seems wildly unclear whether that has anything to do with it being in the mainstream or not. So at a point just becomes hard to see how any of it puts you closer towards a win, even if it's more true than teams in top half. And I also think it's an issue that most of your responses to top half are, I don't think actual engagement, but just saying that whatever impact they can claim is marginal, where I think even if we believe the full extent of your case to be true, it still largely revolves around the same impacts that they did, just for a wildly different reason. So I think that's how a lot of your materials just misses the step it needs to take towards top half. So let's bring in closing opposition. We talked quite a while about op bench because I think you make the exact same argument, you just make it for different reasons. So where opening opposition is like normalization of these ideas happens because of a critical mass, you say it happens because of it being justified or like legitimized by academics and getting the this is an objective fact stamp. They say it's bad because people internalize those views and use them to base their votes on it, and then the policies that result from that are bad, and you say it's bad because individual people, agents would internalize it and then would be assholes, excuse my French, would be mean to people that they've internalized horrible thoughts about. So I'm not sure, even if these arguments were perfectly equally well made, I don't think you attempt to explain why yours is more persuasive or necessarily more, I don't know, more impactful, affects a different kind of people. It just seems like a very, very similar argument, even if the reasons you give for it are very, very different. So it's like these two things prove the exact same impact. Either one of those things could be more persuasive, but you don't say why it is. I think you say why it's different a lot, but not why it's more persuasive. The other thing I'd say is sometimes it is less different than you say it is. At points, I think the argument that you make about scientific legitimization is very, very similar to mainstream legitimization in the sense that the only difference is whether or not we believe that people are more more vulnerable to majorities or more vulnerable to science. But other than that, the logic is still, I think, largely similar. So that just means that the argument is very well made, but not differentiated enough. I do think your responses to CG are quite strong. So in terms of, I think first of all, just pointing out that the basic assumption they make, I'm not sure if it's important that it's inconsistent, but I do think you sufficiently point out why it doesn't help them in any way, or like, I think you point out the characterization issue that I talked about earlier. And I think at points your responses to OG are quite good as well, but in the times that they were, what they usually were doing, so for example, the responses to the stuff about like the chicken or egg mainstream existing or not stuff, if anything, just shows sometimes too much that people would radicalize either way on the very fringes, which is, I think, the least necessary part of their characterization for opening government. So if anything, it shows that a group that they didn't really need to be relevant was even less relevant than they said it was, but not necessarily that something fundamentally necessary to their argument wasn't true. So that's the most important stuff for the results. If you have any questions about that or anything else, come and find us. Otherwise, good luck.